This is part 4 in a series of videos in which I'm attempting to repair and restore this HP9862A plotter. At the end of the previous video I'd got as far as installing the rectifier and power driver board, and I left it running overnight. In fact, I left it running for a day and a half at about 50% load, and it's got reasonably warm but not hot. It's certainly working well within the limits of what I would expect it to do. The transformer didn't get hot, all the capacitors were fine, so I bolted the control panel back in place. Incidentally, this panel is adjustable. You can move it back and forward quite a bit. There are slots on the adjuster screws, but I had marked it before I took it out, so I've just put it back where it was when I took it out. I just put a small mark at each end to show where it was before I took the screws out. So the next thing is to look at the next step in getting this repaired and put back together, and unfortunately certain aspects of assembling this are quite tricky. The main problem with it is there's a row of connections behind this power control board, and although you can get to them fairly easily at the moment, you can't get to them very easily once you've got the top cover on and the power control board fitted. But of course you need the hardware and top cover on before you can do any meaningful testing. So the way I'm going to assemble this is I'm going to take the boards back out, at least the top two boards. I'm not going to take the motherboard out, and then I'm going to refit the top cover of the instrument and reattach the hinge bar. And what I can do after that is to reattach the connections. All these connections go to the mechanics that bolt to the top cover, and before I reattach the mechanical parts, I want to service those and inspect them separately, so I'll do that as a separate video. But for this video I want to get the top cover attached, and then I want to look at the X slide potentiometer. If you remember, there was an issue with it that I need to try and find a solution for. But first thing to do is we'll get these boards popped back out. Okay, so what I can do now is get the top cover bolted back on. These are the connections I'm referring to. There's a row of them here. Not that many, but they're difficult to get to once the board is fitted and the top cover's fitted, but they need to be in place before you can get much further with the assembly. So I'll get the top cover bolted back in place. I'll do that off camera because I need to reach around the camera at the moment, and I can't reach far enough to get the cover bolted back in. So I'll get it bolted back in, but it's just 3 screws, and then align it, tighten the screws down, and then I'll get back on camera and we can go from that point. Okay, that's the top cover bolted back in place. I've aligned it to make sure that it's properly aligned with the chassis. You can maneuver it slightly before you tighten the screws, and I've also tightened the block that the motherboard passes through. So that's the basic chassis work done. The next thing I want to do is turn my attention to the mechanics, and so I need to do that before I refit them so that I can get them reconnected to the motherboard before I start fitting the main boards into the chassis. So I'll get this assembly out of the way, we'll have a look at the mechanics and see what needs to be done. Okay, so here is the plotter mechanics. This is the heart of the machine. Just flip this over so you can see what's on the other side. So as you can see, nothing much there. We've got a bearing block. This is the X drive motor, and this motor obviously has to be more powerful than the Y drive motor because it has to drive the entire arm back and forth, whereas the Y drive motor only needs to drive the head up and down, the pen head up and down. Okay, so I'll need to replace this foam. As usual, it's just disintegrating, and this is here to support the tops of the boards, so you can see where it rests on the boards and stops them waving about. And bit of a clean, but other than that, not much needs doing under here. Luckily it is fairly flat, so it doesn't appear to be bent. I'll be doing some more careful measurements, but it does appear to be fairly flat, which is quite good. And we'll flip it back over. Okay, so looking at it from the back, let's move the lights, I hope you can see this a bit better. The main thing we have an issue with, let's get this tape off, is this slide potentiometer. This is the X-position potentiometer. It's supposed to be double-sided tape holding this to this metal plate. This metal plate is really beaten up, so I'm not quite sure what's happened to this. It looks like someone's been trying to lever it out, so don't know what's happened there. I don't know what state this slide is in, but what I'm going to do is desolder it from the wires at the end, and then try and find a good solution to reattach it to this bar. But I will clean the bar up and get rid of, there's a lot of kind of burrs and scuffs and marks on here where it's been damaged, so I'll file all those back so they're smooth and flush, and then decide what we're going to do about reattaching this. This is supposed to be attached to this bar so it doesn't bow out in the middle, but as you can see it's got a very pronounced bow to it. So anyway, I'll get this unsoldered, and then we'll see what we can do about trying to straighten it out. Okay, so I've managed to separate this without I think doing too much damage. So we've got this copper strip on the back, and judging by the material that's on here, I think this used to be bonded to this material, which in turn used to be stuck to the metal plate. So I think this was just double-sided tape, and obviously also is insulating the back of the bar from this metal support. So I need to tidy this up, get rid of all the scuffs and scrapes. It is bent at both ends as well, so I'll need to straighten this out very carefully, and then once I've done that, I need to decide what I'm going to do with this. Now luckily it's thin enough so that I think just some modern high performance double-sided tape should hold it in place. The only problem with it at the moment is that it's twisted as well as bent, so I need to see if the tape that I intend to use will take up the twist, if you like, that's in this, because if it doesn't, then all that's going to happen is this will just fall off the backing plate again. I don't want to use epoxy. If I can help it, it's more likely to do damage than repair this, so what I'm going to do is clean this up a bit more. It might be possible to very carefully redeform the ends. I don't want to do it in the center because I don't want to overheat the slide, but sometimes what you can do, because the bend is mainly at these ends where it's been bolted down, I suspect it's been bolted on too hard over the ends of or past the ends of the support, so it's effectively been kind of levered up at both ends. But what I might be able to do is very carefully use a big iron and heat up the ends and then deform it back. This type of material can be slightly formed using heat, but I need to be really careful not to heat up the actual slide or to lift off these gold traces. There is a big gouge mark in it at this end. I suspect this is where it was when it was dropped, and there's obviously a big gouge in the Y slide as well, so chances are they're just witness marks as to where the machine head was when this was dropped. But you can possibly see at this end there's kind of a kink in this PCB at this point, and that's likely just to keep it lifted off the backing plate if I just try and stick it straight back on. Okay, so that's my task for today. I'm going to try and very carefully straighten this out, and I'll clean up the backing plates, find some suitable high performance double-sided tape, and see if I can get this properly repaired. Okay, well, after some very careful work, I've got this bar straightened out, so it's now perfectly straight. I've removed the burrs from it. It still looks a little scuffed. That's just the anodizing has been taken off where it was gouged, but it is now flat and it's straight. If anyone is interested, the original part number for this potentiometer is there. I won't be reusing this. This is the double-sided tape that originally held the potentiometer slide onto the backing plate, and after some very careful work I've now got this flat, and if you look down lengthways, hopefully you can see it's now fairly straight, and the bow that was in the middle has now completely gone. So I've also flattened the ends out as well, so they're now flat, and it will, when I bolt it down, it's not going to bow back up in the middle. And I will at any rate be using some double-sided tape, so I just now need to clean off the back. I'll use some isopropyl alcohol and then a PCB flatting block to get this back to a nice clean surface, and then I can use some decent grade double-sided tape to hold this back down to the backing plate. And just need to recheck to make sure that I haven't done any damage to the slide before I continue. So it should be around 20k from end to end, which it is. We'll go about halfway up, 3/4, and about 1/4 of the way. Okay, that's looking good. So as I said, the next step is to get this mounted back onto the backing plate, and what I can then do is put this back onto the plotter chassis, the plotter drive part of the chassis, and get it soldered back into place. Can then get that part refitted to the main chassis, but I'll get this done first. And what I'm going to do this now. I'm going to leave this to cure overnight. The double-sided tape I use, although it's supposed to stick instantly, it does always seem to work better if it's left overnight, just to go off a little bit. But I don't want to use epoxy. If I use epoxy and then I get problems in the future, I'll never be able to get this back off again without damaging it. So I want to make sure that I use something that's going to give me at least half a chance of dealing with any issues with this in the future. Okay, so I've reattached the potentiometer PCB back onto its backing plate. It is now nice and straight, and it's nicely attached, and I haven't done any damage to the actual potentiometer track. So it's nice and straight. I can now bolt this back into the sub-chassis and reattach the wires. And what we'll do then is reattach the slider brushes and see if this actually works. Okay, I've resoldered the potentiometer track to the wires. I've bolted it back onto the chassis, as you can see, and it has gone on there quite nicely. It's now sitting there nice and flat, and before it was bowed forward and touching this support, so you can see how far it was bent out of shape before. So I'll put it back in to what appears to be the correct place. This might need adjusting to get the resistance in the correct position relative to the platter. But the next thing I want to do is to try and refit the brushes to this. There's a little spring brush carrier assembly. Let's grab that, which is this, and as you can see, it needs a bit of a clean as well. And then this is sprung, and it sits essentially on the back of this, and the brushes run along the tracks, and then this brush here with all the dust and fluff that I'll clean off is the one that makes contact with the actual resistive track. And so I'll get this cleaned. I'll check that it's not bent incorrectly. Doesn't look quite right, but I'll make sure it's properly aligned, and then I'll screw it back onto the carrier. Okay, I've got the wipers refitted wasn't reading anything at all at first, and it turned out these top two contacts had been bent so far back because this was bowed out that they were no longer making contact now that the track was back in its proper position. So I've adjusted those, refitted them, checked the adjustments of the other two sets of brushes. So there are a pair at the top, next one down, and these two are connected together, and then there's the one that runs along the actual track. So I've got the multimeter connected between two of the contacts, so as we now move this in the X direction, we should see the multimeter responding accordingly. So it should go up to around 20k at one end and then down close to 0 when we approach the other end. You can see it's moving nice and smoothly, it's not kind of jumping, there are no dead spots, and nice and steady once we stop. So that's looking quite promising. It's certainly a lot better than it was, nice and straight. The brushes are tracking nice and evenly down the center of each of the potentiometer rails. So that's it for this video. In the next video we'll refit this into the main chassis, and then we'll start looking at actually trying to reassemble the electronics.